Hello everyone, and welcome back to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to fall asleep, and I'm here to deliver. But before starting, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Most people assume night shifts are quiet. Empty hallways, dim lights, the hum of vending machines, nothing out of the ordinary. For the most part, they're right. But anyone who has worked in an old building at night will tell you, the silence isn't always comforting. Sometimes it breathes. Sometimes it watches. I never believed in ghosts. I laughed at horror movies, rolled my eyes when people talked about hauntings, and thought the stories about security guards quitting in the middle of their shift were exaggerated. That was before I started working at the St. Vincent Tower. It's an old office building downtown, 15 stories tall, built in the early 1900s. The kind of place with creaky wooden floors under the carpet and thick, heavy doors that make you feel like you're walking through a time capsule. Some parts have been renovated over the years, but others, well, let's just say they don't bother fixing things that aren't a safety hazard. I got the job about 6 months ago. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. My shift started at 10 p.m. and ended at 6 a.m. My duties were simple: patrol the floors, check security cameras, lock up any open doors, and report anything suspicious. Most nights, I didn't even see another person. Just me, my flashlight, and the quiet hum of the building. The first few weeks were uneventful. I had my routine down to a science. First, I'd check the lobby, make sure no one had wandered in. Then, it'd take the elevator up, checking each floor as I went. After that, it'd settle into the security office, monitor the cameras, and count down the hours until morning. There was something oddly peaceful about walking through empty hallways. The soft glow of emergency exit signs, the occasional flicker of a dying fluorescent light. It was eerie, sure, but in a way that felt more lonely than threatening. I told myself the stories were just that, stories. People working night shifts get tired. They hear things. Their minds play tricks on them. That's what I told myself. But then there was the elevator. The building had 2 elevators, but only one worked properly. The other, a relic from the 1940s, was permanently out of order. It sat there, its doors shut, collecting dust. The working one was old, but functional most of the time. It groaned and creaked as it moved, but it got the job done. There was no 13th floor on the panel, just 12, then 14. Some old buildings do that, skip 13 because of superstition. I never thought much about it, until the night the elevator stopped on 13. But before I get to that, let me tell you how the night started. That evening was like any other. I arrived at 9:45 p.m., swiped my badge at the security desk, and nodded at the day guard as he packed up to leave. "Quiet night," he said, "same as always." I nodded back, stifling a yawn. I grabbed a coffee from the break room before heading to the security office. The monitors showed the usual empty hallways, locked doors, nothing unusual. I leaned back in my chair and let the silence settle in. At 11 p.m., I started my first patrol. I took the elevator to the top floor, planning to work my way down. As I stepped inside, the old elevator shuddered like it always did, and I pressed the button for 15. The doors slid shut with a slow, reluctant motion, and the car began to rise. The ride was smooth at first. I watched the numbers climb, 6, 7, 8, until suddenly the lights flickered. Not unusual in an old building, but it made my stomach tighten just a little. I shifted my weight, waiting for the next floor to light up. 9, 10. Then a slight jolt. I frowned, glancing at the buttons. 11, 12. The elevator slowed, almost stopping. I expected 15 to light up next, but instead, the panel showed 13. I stared at it. That floor didn't exist. The building skipped from 12 to 14. I knew that. I had ridden this elevator hundreds of times, and yet the light for 13 was glowing, a dull orange against the metallic panel. The doors didn't open. The car just sat there, humming softly. I reached out and pressed 15 again. Nothing. I pressed the door open button. Still nothing. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Then the elevator let out a low ding like it had reached its destination, and the doors slid open. I didn't move. Beyond the threshold was a hallway that shouldn't exist. It was dimly lit, lined with old, peeling wallpaper. The carpet was faded red, the kind you'd see in a hotel from the 1920s. A long corridor stretched ahead, ending in darkness. The air that drifted in was different, stale, like a room that hadn't been opened in decades. My gut screamed at me not to step out. I jabbed the close door button repeatedly. The doors hesitated. Then, with an almost reluctant sigh, they slid shut. The elevator shuddered, then lurched upward. The number 14 lit up, then 15. The doors opened again. I stepped out quickly, heart pounding. I turned to look at the panel, expecting 13 to still be lit. It wasn't. It was gone, like it had never been there at all. I told myself the elevator had malfunctioned, that old wiring had caused a glitch, that I was tired and my eyes were playing tricks on me. But as I stepped into the hallway, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling, something made me stop. My boots had left wet footprints on the carpet, but I hadn't stepped in anything, and the air around me smelled faintly of something old, something rotten. And then, somewhere down the hallway, I heard a door creak open. I stood there, my breath caught in my throat, listening. The sound was unmistakable. A door creaking open somewhere in the hallway behind me. Not a gust of wind, not the settling of an old building. This was deliberate, controlled. For a second, I told myself it was the janitor. Maybe someone else was working late. Maybe I just hadn't noticed them on the cameras. But that didn't explain the footprints. I looked down at them again. The moisture had already started to fade, but I could still see the distinct shape of my boots, perfectly outlined on the dull carpet. I lifted one foot slowly, checking the bottom. Dry. My skin prickled. A sound like a whisper of fabric brushing against fabric came from down the hall. I turned my head slightly, eyes locked on the darkness beyond the dim overhead lights. The offices along the hallway were closed. I knew they were locked. I had checked them earlier. So why did I feel like someone was standing just beyond my line of sight? I forced myself to move. My job was to check things out. That's what security guards do. They investigate strange noises, not stand frozen in place like a scared kid. Still, I hesitated before stepping forward. Each step felt too loud, my boots pressing into the carpet, absorbing the sound but somehow amplifying the weight of my presence. The hallway stretched ahead, and I scanned the doors, looking for the one that had opened. Midway down the corridor, I saw it. A single door, slightly ajar. It was one of the older offices, the ones rarely used. No one should have been in there. The last time I had checked, it had been locked. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on. The beam cut through the dim hallway, landing on the doorframe. The brass handle glinted under the light. My pulse pounded in my ears as I reached out and pushed the door open. The office inside was wrong. It wasn't just dark. It was emptier than it should have been. I had checked this room before. It had a desk, some old filing cabinets, a couple of chairs pushed against the wall. Now, it was nearly bare. The desk was still there, but the chair was missing. The filing cabinet stood against the far wall, but one of the drawers was half open. Papers were scattered across the floor in a pattern that made no sense, like someone had thrown them but never picked them up. And the air smelled like earth. Not dust, not mildew, dirt, like freshly dug soil after a heavy rain. I swallowed hard. I wasn't sure what unsettled me more, the changes in the room or the fact that it looked like someone had been in there only minutes before I arrived. I moved the flashlight slowly across the room. Nothing. The shadows stretched unnaturally, bending against the beam of light in a way that made my stomach tighten. I exhaled through my nose, forcing my heartbeat to slow. I just needed to document this, report it, and lock the door. I stepped inside. As soon as I crossed the threshold, the floor felt softer, like the carpet had extra padding underneath. I stopped, pressing my heel down slightly. The sensation was strange, almost like I was stepping on damp ground. I swept the light toward the corner of the room, and that's when I saw it. The missing chair. It was shoved against the far wall, its back facing me. Not knocked over, not placed casually, pushed there, deliberately. The air was heavier now. It settled on my skin like a weighted blanket. I didn't want to touch the chair. I knew I had to. Slowly, I moved forward. Each step felt sluggish, like I was pushing through something unseen. My breathing was steady, controlled, but every muscle in my body was tense. I reached out with my free hand and grabbed the chair's backrest. As soon as my fingers touched the wood, the lights in the office flickered violently. The overhead fluorescent bulb stuttered, casting jagged shadows against the walls. My flashlight flickered, and for half a second, just half a second, I saw movement in the reflection of the filing cabinet. Something behind me. I spun around. The office was empty. Nothing moved. But the door was half closed. I knew I had left it open. I was sure of it. My stomach clenched. I swallowed hard, tightening my grip on the flashlight. The silence pressed against me. I took one step toward the door. Another. Then, a sound. Not loud, not dramatic, just subtle. A slow, deliberate tap, like a single knock against the far wall. I froze. The tap came again. Slow, purposeful. I turned my head slightly, not wanting to look, but needing to. The sound had come from the corner, from the shadows, from where the chair had been before it was moved. The chair was still against the far wall, untouched, but the shadows near it had changed. They weren't where they should have been. The angle was wrong. The shape was off. I took a slow, careful step back toward the door. The tapping stopped. For a moment, everything was completely silent. Then, a whisper, not a voice, not words, just breath, close, too close. I lunged for the door and yanked it open. As soon as I stepped out, the weight in the air vanished. The hallway was just as I had left it, dimly lit, quiet, empty. The second my boots hit the carpet, the overhead lights stopped flickering. I turned, breathing hard, and looked back at the office. The door was wide open again. The chair was back in its original position, like it had never been moved at all. A chill ran down my spine. I backed away, my fingers wrapped so tightly around the flashlight that my knuckles ached. Something was wrong with this floor. Something was watching. I turned and walked quickly back toward the elevator, my pulse hammering. I needed to get out of there. I needed to check the security cameras. I needed proof that I wasn't losing my mind. But as I reached the elevator and pressed the button, I noticed something. The footprints I had left earlier, the ones from the moisture on my boots, they were gone, as if I had never walked there at all. And just as the elevator doors slid open, I heard it. The office door creaked again, but this time, it was closing, slowly, deliberately, as if someone was pulling it shut. I barely slept after that shift. Even after I left the building, the feeling of being watched clung to me like a second skin. I kept replaying it in my mind, the office door, the chair, the missing footprints. And the worst part, I had no proof. The security footage showed nothing. I had rewound the footage multiple times, watched every angle, every second. The cameras covering that hallway never showed the door opening or closing, never showed me moving the chair, never showed anything out of place. It was like it had all happened in a different reality. The only thing I could see was myself, standing in the hallway, staring into an empty office, slowly backing away. That should have been enough for me to report it, to tell someone. But who would believe me? So, when my next shift started, I kept my head down and did my rounds like normal. I avoided that hallway for as long as possible, checking every other floor first. The night dragged on, slow and heavy, but nothing felt off. No weird noises. No flickering lights. By the time I finally reached the 13th floor, I had almost convinced myself that maybe I had imagined it. Then the elevator doors opened, and the light inside the office at the end of the hallway was already on. I stared at it, my hand still hovering over the control panel. That room was never supposed to be lit. The office had no assigned workers. No one had a reason to be in there. I stepped out cautiously, scanning the hallway. The air felt normal. Nothing heavy, nothing unnatural. Just the usual scent of old carpet and cleaning chemicals. The faint hum of the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the soft click of the elevator doors sliding shut behind me. I approached the office slowly, listening. No movement inside. No sound at all. I reached the doorway and hesitated before stepping in. The chair was exactly where it had been the first time I checked. The desk was untouched. The scattered papers from before were gone. Everything looked normal, but the smell wasn't. That strange earthy scent was stronger this time, like damp soil and something. Older. I reached for the light switch, but before I could touch it, the elevator dinged. I turned back toward the hallway, just in time to see the elevator doors slide open. And the elevator was not empty. Someone stood inside. A man. Or at least, I thought it was a man. He was standing in the back corner, facing the wall. His clothes were dark, and his posture was stiff, unmoving. I swallowed hard. Hey, he didn't respond. The elevator didn't move. The door stayed open, waiting. I took a slow step forward. You all right? Nothing. The air in the hallway shifted. It wasn't colder, wasn't louder. Just different. I stepped closer, my instincts screaming at me to leave it alone. But my job was to check on people. I reached the elevator doors and hesitated. Sir? Still no movement. I stepped inside. The elevator smelled wrong. Not like sweat or stale air. It smelled like that same dirt from the office. The man still didn't turn. I could see the faint rise and fall of his shoulders, slow and unnatural, like he was breathing too carefully. Something about his stance was off. His head was slightly tilted, his arms too stiff at his sides. I glanced at the control panel. No buttons were pressed. The elevator should not have moved without a destination. I reached out hesitantly. Sir, are you okay? His head snapped sideways so violently that I stumbled back against the wall. Not a slow turn. Not a natural movement. Just snap. His face was still angled away from me, but now I could see the sharp curve of his jaw. His skin was pale, almost gray under the dim elevator lights. The doors started to close. I lunged forward and hit the button for the lobby. The elevator shuddered violently. The man's shoulders twitched. The lights flickered. I pressed the button again, harder this time. Hey, you need to get off if you're not. His neck twisted again, and I saw his mouth. It was wrong. Too wide. The edges stretched back too far, past where his jaw should have stopped. His lips didn't move, but the skin around them twitched, as if something was writhing just beneath the surface. I slammed my fist against the emergency stop button. The elevator jolted, and for a second, Everything froze. The man, the lights, the air itself. Then, the overhead light exploded. Glass shattered around me, and the elevator plummeted. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed the car was that twisted, unnatural grin. And then, silence. Not the sound of cables snapping, not the rush of wind from a free fall, just absolute, suffocating silence. I braced myself for the impact that never came. The elevator just stopped. The emergency lights flickered on, casting a dim orange glow. My chest heaved, breath coming in ragged gasps. My hand was still pressed against the control panel, my palms slick with sweat. I wasn't falling. I wasn't dead. I exhaled shakily, forcing myself to check the buttons again. The lobby button was still lit. The floor indicator flickered. 13. My stomach dropped. The doors slid open, and I was back on the 13th floor. The hallway was empty. The office door was closed. The air smelled normal again. The man was gone. I bolted out of the elevator and didn't stop until I reached the security office. I locked the door behind me and pulled up the security feed, hands trembling as I rewound the footage. Nothing. No man in the elevator. No flickering lights. No free fall. Just me, standing there alone, looking terrified of absolutely nothing. I ran my hands through my hair, gripping at my scalp. My breathing was uneven, my pulse erratic. I had felt the drop. I had seen him. I knew I wasn't losing my mind, but the camera said otherwise. I turned back toward the monitors, forcing myself to breathe. I needed to think, needed to figure this out. Then, a notification popped up on the screen. An elevator call request. Someone had just pressed the button from the 13th floor. The cameras still showed an empty hallway. The elevator doors were still open, but the request was there, and I wasn't the one who had pressed it. The notification on the screen wouldn't go away. Elevator call request, floor 13. It stared back at me like a dare. The system didn't glitch like this. If the button was pressed, it meant someone had called the elevator, but there was no one there. I stared at the feed, my pulse hammering in my ears. The hallway was still empty. No movement, no shadows, nothing. I should have ignored it. I should have left it alone. But something in me refused to let it go. I needed to see for myself. I grabbed my flashlight and pushed out of the security office, my legs moving before my brain had fully caught up. My footsteps echoed through the empty halls as I made my way back to the elevators. The doors were still open when I got there. The button for the 13th floor was lit. I hesitated just outside the threshold. The air inside the elevator felt different. Not cold, not warm, just wrong. Like the space itself wasn't meant to exist. I didn't want to step inside, but I forced myself to. I reached for the control panel, hovering my hand over the closed doors button. Then, a new floor lit up. I didn't touch anything, but the button for B2, the second basement level, started glowing. The doors slid shut. I slammed the door open button, but nothing happened. The panel locked up, unresponsive to everything I tried. The elevator started moving down. B1. Then, B2. The doors opened with a soft chime. The air hit me immediately. It was thick, damp, and stale, like I had just stepped into a space that had been sealed off for years. The overhead lights were dim, barely flickering, casting long shadows along the cracked concrete floor. I stepped out slowly, gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles ached. B2 wasn't used anymore. At least, it wasn't supposed to be. The storage rooms down here had been abandoned for decades. Old maintenance files, broken office furniture, useless junk no one had bothered to clear out. The hallway stretched out before me, lined with heavy metal doors. Most of them were locked. Some were slightly open, and one at the very end was wide open. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I could feel something pulling me toward it, some quiet, awful knowledge deep in my gut that told me I had to look. The smell of dirt was stronger here. I stepped forward, flashlight beam bouncing off rusted metal and cracked tiles. My boots scuffed against something soft, dust so thick it looked like a second layer of flooring. Except it wasn't just dust. I knelt down, running my fingers through the disturbed patches of dirt. It was fine, dry, almost like ashes. Something had been buried here. A noise broke the silence. A whisper of movement behind me. I spun around, heart slamming into my ribs. The hallway was empty, but I wasn't alone. I could feel it. I wasn't just being watched. Something was here. Something knew I was here. I turned back toward the open doorway, my flashlight shaking in my grip. The room inside was pitch black. My beam barely cut through it, swallowed by the depth of the space. I took a slow step inside, and my flashlight died. The darkness rushed in too fast, like a living thing, like it had been waiting to be let in. I staggered back, pulse hammering in my throat. I smacked the flashlight against my palm, but the batteries were completely dead. Then, the sound of breathing. Low, shallow, right in front of me. I froze, my fingers tightening around the useless flashlight. The breathing wasn't mine. It was too slow, too deliberate. Then, a footstep right in front of me. Then another, closer. I took a step back. My heel hit the threshold of the door. The air thickened, pressing against my chest. My lungs locked up. My body refused to move. Then, a voice. Low, wrong. You shouldn't be here. It was right in front of me. I bolted. I didn't look back. I ran so fast I barely felt my feet hitting the floor. I slammed into the elevator, mashing the closed doors button over and over and over. The doors hesitated. Then they slammed shut. The elevator lurched upward, moving so fast my stomach flipped. The walls groaned, the air thick with something I couldn't see. The lights flickered violently. Then the elevator stopped. I didn't check what floor I was on. I didn't care. The doors opened, and I ran. I didn't stop until I was back in the security office, locking the door behind me, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My hands shook as I reached for the monitors, pulling up the basement cameras. The feed flickered. Then, a shape, standing in the open doorway of that room. It wasn't a man. It wasn't human. The figure was tall, its limbs slightly too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its face, there wasn't one. Just that stretched, impossible grin. And then, the feed cut to static. The building was silent. The elevator wasn't moving anymore, and I was still trapped inside. I grabbed my radio, my fingers shaking as I pressed the button. This is, my voice cracked. I swallowed, trying again. This is security. If anyone can hear me, I need static. I pressed the button again. Still nothing. I was alone. Completely. Utterly. Alone. Then, something knocked on the office door. Not loud, not frantic. Just a single, deliberate knock. And then another. And another. I didn't move. The doorknob twitched. Slow. Controlled. Testing. I grabbed the desk, my breath stuck in my throat. My legs refused to work. Then, a voice. Right outside the door. Let me in. My body locked up. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. Then, the sound of footsteps. Walking away. Slow. Deliberate. They faded into the hallway. And then, silence! I didn't move for what felt like hours. Eventually, the radio crackled to life. A voice, a real one, came through. Security, check in. My breath ripped out of me in a shaky gasp. I scrambled for the radio, gripping it like a lifeline. I am here. My voice barely worked. I need someone down here. Now. I could hear the shift in tone from the other end. Copy. Stay put. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stared at the office door, waiting, and for the rest of the night. The elevator never moved again. I sat in the security office, gripping the radio so hard my fingers ached. The silence in the building stretched long and unnatural, pressing against my eardrums like the aftermath of a deafening explosion. My chest was still rising and falling in shallow, panicked breaths, my skin damp with cold sweat. I didn't dare move. Outside the door, nothing stirred. The footsteps had stopped. The knocking had stopped. The slow, testing turn of the doorknob had stopped. But I knew I wasn't alone. The security monitor still flickered with static, the feed from the basement cameras dead. The last thing I had seen was that grinning figure standing at the threshold of the room in B2. I didn't want to look at the screen anymore. A sudden burst of static came from the radio again, jolting me upright. Security, check in. We're heading down now. The voice belonged to Mark, the other night guard. My relief was instant, but it was tangled with something else, something colder, more instinctive. I needed him to get here, but I also needed him to stay away. I pressed the button. My voice was still shaking. Copy. Do not take the elevator. A short pause. Then, what? I swallowed hard, licking my dry lips. Take the stairs. Do not use the elevator. Another pause. Then the radio crackled back. Oh, all right. Be there in 5. I didn't realize how much tension had built up in my body until the radio fell silent again. I exhaled, resting my forehead against my palm. 5 minutes. 5 minutes and I wouldn't be alone anymore. I counted the seconds. Nothing happened. The hallway outside the office was too quiet, but at least the doorknob hadn't moved again. My heart was finally slowing down, my breathing evening out. The rational part of my brain was screaming for an explanation, but there was none. There never would be. The elevator had moved on its own. It had taken me somewhere I wasn't supposed to go, and something down there had seen me. Then the radio crackled again. We're in the stairwell, almost there. I gripped it like a lifeline. Copy. I glanced back at the security monitors, but the feeds were still useless. The static hadn't stopped. The building's entire surveillance system was fried. Another minute passed. Then, a click. The elevator doors opened, right outside the office. I stopped breathing. The radio slipped from my fingers, landing on the desk with a dull thud. My pulse slammed against my ribcage. I knew no one had called it. It had come up on its own. The hallway beyond my office door was quiet. Too quiet. No footsteps. No voices. Then, a single knock. Right outside. I couldn't move. The knock came again, slower this time. Then a pause. Then the doorknob twisted, just slightly. The breath in my lungs turned to ice. The stairwell wasn't fast enough. The other guards weren't here yet. I was still alone, still trapped. I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping the edge of the desk so hard my knuckles burned. I would not open that door. Another knock, and then the sound of footsteps. Walking away. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The minutes stretched, my ears straining in the silence, waiting for something else to happen. Some final, awful sign that whatever had come this close was still out there. But the only sound left was my own heartbeat. Then, Voices. Real voices. "Hey, where are you?" Mark's voice. I practically ripped the door open, staggering into the hall. Mark and two other guards stood near the stairwell, looking around, confused. They hadn't seen anything. The hallway was empty. The elevator doors were still open. My stomach twisted as I turned to face them, words catching in my throat. How could I explain this? How could I make them believe me? Mark frowned. "What the hell happened to you?" I must have looked awful. My uniform was drenched in sweat, my skin clammy and pale. For a second, I considered telling them everything. Then I glanced at the elevator. The button panel was completely normal. No floor 13. No B2 lit up. No malfunctioning lights. I shook my head. I don't know. My voice was hoarse. "Something's wrong with the elevator." Mark nodded, looking at it like it might bite. "Yeah, no kidding. It just came up on its own." My stomach dropped. "What?" He nodded again. "We were halfway up the stairs when we heard the chime. Figured someone else was here." He looked around. "But there's no one. No one. No one but me." I took a slow step back into the office, pressing my fingers against my temple. This wasn't happening. This wasn't real. Mark exhaled, shaking his head. "Let's shut it down for the night. No one's using this thing until maintenance looks at it." I didn't argue. The rest of the shift passed in a blur. By morning, the elevator was still shut down. And for the first time in the history of this building, it never moved again. The morning light streamed through the lobby windows as I stepped outside, the crisp air hitting my face like a slap. My shift was over. The building was waking up, filling with workers who had no idea what had happened in the dark hours before dawn. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the entrance, at the towering glass and steel structure that had suddenly become something else, something wrong. The elevator never moved again. It was shut down indefinitely after that night. The maintenance crew came in, ran their diagnostics, checked the circuits, the wiring, the motor, everything. And according to them, there was nothing wrong. But it wouldn't work. The doors wouldn't open. The buttons wouldn't light up. They called in a specialist, but even he was stumped. There was no mechanical failure, no power issue, no reasonable explanation for why it had simply stopped functioning. I never used another elevator in that building again. I stayed for a few more months, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination, that exhaustion had twisted the night into something worse than it really was. But deep down, I knew better. It wasn't exhaustion. It wasn't just in my head. Something had been down there. Something had stepped out of the dark when that elevator reached floor 13, a floor that shouldn't exist. Something had knocked on my office door, and I had been one bad decision away from opening it. Even now, years later, I still dream about that night. The flickering security feeds, the cold, empty silence, the weight of something unseen pressing against my chest, the knock on the door. I wake up covered in sweat, my pulse hammering in my ears, and for a second, I think I hear it again, a single, slow knock. And every time, I remind myself of one thing. Some doors should never be opened. Some floors should never exist. And some elevators should never move again. I was a subway maintenance worker, the kind of guy who made sure your train rides were smooth, even if it meant working odd hours deep underground where sunlight never reached. Most of my shifts were at night, fewer passengers, fewer trains, but a whole lot of eerie silence. There's something about being in a subway station after midnight that feels wrong. The sounds change. The air feels thicker. And sometimes you swear you hear footsteps behind you. But when you turn around, there's nothing there. I had worked for the Metropolitan Transit for years. I knew every corner of those tunnels, every misplaced screw, every flickering light. The night shift wasn't glamorous, but I preferred it. Fewer people meant fewer complaints. It also meant more time to do my work without distractions. Most nights, it was just me and a handful of other workers, sometimes an electrician fixing faulty wires, sometimes a janitor mopping the endless floors. We weren't friends, just colleagues, nodding to each other as we passed. The only constant presence was the low hum of the subway and the occasional gust of wind from a passing train. One of my usual duties was inspecting the older tunnels, sections that hadn't been renovated in decades. These tunnels were different. The walls were covered in grime, the air smelled stale, and the silence felt heavier, as if the concrete itself was holding secrets. Every now and then, I'd hear something strange, a distant knock, a soft echo that shouldn't have been there, but I always chalked it up to the old infrastructure settling. At least, that's what I told myself. There was one station in particular that always made me uneasy. It wasn't officially abandoned, but it had been closed to the public for years due to structural issues. Yet, trains still passed through it. That was my area to inspect. The entrance was sealed off with a rusted gate, and the platform was covered in dust so thick it muffled my footsteps. Most nights, I would do my rounds, jot down notes on maintenance issues, and leave as quickly as possible. But one night changed everything. It was late, well past 2 a.m. I was assigned to check the old station once again. I wasn't alone that night. A newer worker was with me. He wasn't used to the graveyard shift yet, and I could tell the atmosphere unsettled him. "Feels like a damn horror movie," he muttered as we made our way down the tunnel. I smirked, but didn't respond. What was the point? He'd get used to it, or quit. The station looked the same as always. Empty, still, forgotten. My boots crunched over the dust-covered tiles as I walked along the platform, shining my flashlight over the wall. That's when I saw it, something small but out of place. A single, fresh footprint in the dust. It wasn't mine. It wasn't his. I stopped. My stomach tightened. No one had been down here in days. There was no way a footprint should have been there. The guy with me noticed my hesitation. "What's wrong?" I didn't answer. I just knelt down and ran my fingers over the mark. The dust around it was undisturbed, except for the print itself. No drag marks, no signs of someone walking through. Just one single footprint. I stood up slowly, my ears straining against the silence. There was nothing. Just the hum of the tunnels. "I thought no one came down here," the worker said, shifting nervously. "They don't," I replied. I forced myself to finish the inspection, but my hands felt cold and my heartbeat was too fast. We left that station quicker than usual that night, but I didn't say anything else. I didn't want to think about it. Maybe I had missed something. Maybe there was a logical explanation. I should have trusted my instincts, because that was only the beginning. That single footprint stayed in my mind long after that shift ended. At first, I told myself it had to be from our previous worker. Maybe someone had come down to check the station earlier, and I just hadn't heard about it. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. There were strict protocols. No one entered that station without clearance, and there hadn't been a scheduled inspection for over a week. Even if someone had ignored protocol, how did they leave just one footprint? No other marks. No trail. Still, I pushed it aside. It was just dust, right? Maybe some weird airflow disturbed the surface, creating the illusion of a footprint. That explanation worked well enough during the day when the city was awake, and the subway stations were filled with noise and movement. But when I returned for my next night shift, the unease came back. I didn't mention it to anyone, not the other workers, not my supervisor. But I did make one small change. I started paying attention, not just to the stations, but to the sounds, the air, the way my flashlight cast shadows on the walls. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. A few nights later, I was assigned to a different section, nowhere near the old station. That should have put my mind at ease, but it didn't. That night, I was working alone. I preferred it that way most of the time. No small talk, no waiting around for someone else to catch up. Just me, my checklist, and the familiar routine. I started in one of the more modern tunnels, checking for loose panels and flickering lights. It was quiet, just the way I liked it. But about an hour into my shift, something felt off. It started with the radio. Every worker carried a radio for communication. The subway tunnels messed with reception sometimes, but it never had any real issues until that night. I was walking along a narrow maintenance walkway, my boots echoing against the concrete, when my radio crackled. Not the usual static, but something else. Something almost rhythmic. At first, I thought it was just another worker trying to reach me, so I lifted the radio to my mouth. "Yeah, I hear you." "Say again?" No response. Just more static. I adjusted the dial, switching channels to see if maybe I was picking up interference. But the sound didn't stop. It grew fainter, then stronger again, as if shifting with my movements. I slowed down, standing still in the tunnel. The air was thick, damp with that usual underground smell of metal and dust. Then, through the static, I heard it, something that made my blood run cold. A voice. It was faint, barely more than a whisper, but I knew I wasn't imagining it. The words were muffled, distorted by the interference, but I caught something that made my skin crawl. "You're not supposed to be here." I froze. The radio was pressed against my ear now, my grip so tight my fingers ached. "Who is this?" I asked. Silence. Then the static cut out completely. I stood there for a moment, my breath coming a little too fast. Was it a prank? Another worker messing with me? But who would do that? And how? I switched the radio off and back on. Nothing but the usual empty frequency. I didn't know what to do. Reporting it to my supervisor seemed pointless. What would I even say? That I thought I heard a voice through the static? That I was getting spooked over nothing? I shook it off and forced myself to keep moving, but I was hyper-aware of every sound around me. The rest of the shift was uneventful, but I couldn't get the voice out of my head. The next night, I decided to test something. I took the same route, through the same tunnel, at roughly the same time. And just like before, about an hour in, the radio crackled. This time, I didn't speak. I just listened. The static grew louder, then softened. And then, "Go back." The words were clearer now. I could hear them over the hum of the tunnel, over my own breathing. I spun around, shining my flashlight in both directions. Nothing. The tunnel stretched empty in front of me, silent except for the occasional distant rumble of a passing train. I gritted my teeth and pressed the radio button. Who the hell is this? Silence again. Then, it's too late. The static cut out completely. I stood there for a long time, gripping the radio like it could somehow protect me. My heart was hammering in my chest, my palms sweating despite the cold underground air. I wasn't the kind of guy to scare easily, but this was different. I needed answers. The next night, I requested to inspect the old station again, the one with the footprint. I didn't tell anyone why. I just said I wanted to double check something from my last report. When I got there, it looked the same as always. Dusty, forgotten, lifeless. But I wasn't just looking at the walls and floors this time. I was listening. I pulled out my radio and turned it on. Nothing at first, just normal static. Then, as I stepped onto the platform, a low hum. Not from the radio, from the tunnel. It was so soft, I almost missed it. But once I noticed it, I couldn't ignore it, a faint vibration in the air, like the sound of an approaching train. Except there were no scheduled trains for another 2 hours. I stepped closer to the edge, shining my flashlight down the tunnel. The tracks stretched into the darkness, empty. The hum grew louder. Then I heard something else. Footsteps. Not behind me, down the tunnel. They were slow, deliberate. One step, then another. I raised my flashlight, aiming it toward the sound, my breath catching in my throat. The beam landed on the tracks. And for just a second, just the briefest moment, I saw movement. A figure, not walking, standing, still, watching. Then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my flashlight. My radio crackled again. You shouldn't have come back. The voice was right in my ear. I ran. I didn't stop running until I reached the main tunnel leading back to the active subway lines. My breath was ragged, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I wasn't even sure what I was running from. A shadow? A trick of the light? A voice over a faulty radio? But I knew, deep down, it was more than that. Something was there. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. Not yet. I needed to make sense of it first. I went home that morning, locked my door, and sat in the silence of my apartment, staring at the radio it tossed onto the table. My hands still had a slight tremor. I hadn't felt fear like that in years. I had to go back, not because I wanted to, but because I needed to know what I had seen, or if I had seen anything at all. The next night, I got assigned to a different part of the system. I should have been relieved, but instead, I felt like I was leaving something unfinished. That feeling didn't go away. It got worse. The strange events weren't confined to that abandoned station. Wherever I went in the tunnel, the air felt heavier. The silence stretched longer. And then there were the whispers, at first, so faint I thought I was imagining them. But by the end of the week, I wasn't the only one noticing. A few of the other workers started talking about odd things happening on the night shift. Equipment going missing, only to be found in strange places. A toolbox left securely on a bench suddenly appearing at the other end of a tunnel. Flashlights flickering, even with fresh batteries. And the worst of it, the voices. Someone mentioned hearing a name whispered over the radio. Not theirs. Not anyone working that night. Another guy swore he heard the sound of a train approaching a section of track that had been closed for years. I kept my mouth shut. I didn't want to be the guy pushing those stories. But when I saw my supervisor looking more irritated than usual, I took my chance to ask if there were any reported malfunctions with the radios. Radios? He rubbed his face, looking exhausted. Yeah, I've had 3 guys come in this week complaining about interference. But it's not system-wide. Seems to only happen in certain areas. I swallowed hard. Which areas? He glanced at me. Why? Just curiosity. He sighed and pulled up a map. Mostly in the older tunnels. Sections that don't see much traffic. But that's not surprising. Signal's weaker down there. I stared at the map. The locations matched up with the places he'd worked over the past week. It wasn't just me. That night, I went back. I made sure my shift ended near the abandoned station. Once the work was done, I lingered, telling myself I just wanted to check something. I walked slowly down the empty tunnel, past the rusting metal gates, and onto the old platform. The second I stepped onto it, the air changed. It was thick, heavy, like the oxygen had been pulled from the space. I could hear the faint hum again, that same vibration it felt before. I pulled out my radio. The static was waiting for me. I stood there, breathing hard, waiting for the voice. Silence! Then I made a mistake. I spoke first. Who are you? The static pulsed. A faint, rhythmic sound, like distant breathing. I gripped the radio tighter. What do you want? I paused. Then, come and see. The words sent a chill down my spine. My fingers were slick with sweat, my heart hammering against my ribs. Then the station lights flickered. Not the usual dimming from an old circuit. This was different. They pulsed, almost like a heartbeat. The shadows around the platform seemed to stretch and contract with the rhythm of the flickering bulbs. Then I heard it. A train! But that wasn't possible. There were no scheduled trains on this track. This section had been out of commission for years. Yet the sound was unmistakable, the distant rumble of a train moving fast, metal grinding against metal. I turned toward the tunnel, shining my flashlight down the tracks. My breath caught in my throat. The rails were vibrating. The sound grew louder, the tunnel filling with the echo of something massive approaching. Then I saw it. A flicker of headlights in the darkness. It was coming, but no train was scheduled. No tracks were operational here. I took a step back, my instincts screaming at me to run. But something held me there, some terrible, morbid curiosity. The air around me felt electrified, charged with something unnatural. My radio let out a sharp burst of static. The train was getting closer. Then, nothing. The sound vanished. The vibration stopped. The lights in the tunnel flickered one last time and held steady. The tracks in front of me were empty. No train, no headlight, no sign that anything had been there at all. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My legs felt weak, my hands shaking. I turned to leave, but then I saw it. On the far end of the platform, a figure, standing in the shadows. I couldn't make out details, just the outline of a person, standing completely still, watching me. Then, as if the darkness itself swallowed them, they were gone. I didn't run this time. I walked, fast, but I didn't run. I wasn't going to let whatever this was think I was afraid, even if every instinct told me to get the hell out. By the time I made it back to the active tunnel, I felt like I had escaped something I wasn't meant to see. But the worst part, the feeling didn't leave me when I got home. That night, I woke up to my radio turning on by itself. The static filled my room. And through it, I heard the voice again. You should have left. I barely slept after that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the radio static, the voice breaking through in barely a whisper. Every time I tried to convince myself it was in my head, that I was just overtired, something else happened. At work, my tools went missing, only to turn up in places I hadn't been. My flashlight batteries died faster than they should have. The other guys noticed, too, things weren't right in the tunnels. But no one wanted to talk about it. They just worked faster, kept their heads down, and got out as soon as the shift was over. The worst part? The train sounds never really stopped. I started hearing them even in places where it was impossible. Active tracks were one thing, but I could hear that same distant rumble when I was nowhere near any running lines. It got to the point where I had to go back. Not because I wanted to, but because I knew this wasn't over. Whatever was in that station, it had seen me, and I had seen it. And that meant it wasn't going to stop. The next night, I clocked in as usual, but instead of heading to my assigned area, I made my way back to the abandoned station. This time, I wasn't going to run. I needed answers. The platform was as empty as before, the air thick and stale. My boots scraped against the old concrete as I stepped forward, flashlight beam cutting through the dim glow of the emergency lights. I reached for my radio, half expecting the static to be waiting for me. Silence! I swallowed hard. I know you're here, I said, my voice steady despite the way my hands were shaking. What do you want? Nothing. I took another step forward. The weight of the place pressed down on me, thick and suffocating. Then the lights flickered. A sharp crackle of static burst through my radio, loud and sudden. My pulse jumped, but I forced myself to stay still. Then came the voice. Too late. A rush of wind slammed into me, strong enough to make me stumble back. My flashlight flickered. Then I heard it. The train. This time, it wasn't distant. It was here. The tunnel ahead glowed with an unnatural light. The deep, shuddering rumble of something massive on the tracks filled the air. I turned toward the sound, heart pounding against my ribs. The headlights appeared first, twin beams cutting through the darkness, too bright, too white. The rails beneath me vibrated violently, the entire station trembling. A train was coming, but it wasn't the train I had ever seen before. The metal was rusted and blackened, its windows cracked and fogged. The entire thing looked wrong, distorted, stretched, like something half-formed. And it wasn't slowing down. I stepped back, my instincts screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. The train roared forward, and for a split second, I saw inside, saw rows of passengers, their faces hollow, empty, eyes dark voids, staring straight ahead. And then, at the very front, standing in the conductor's spot, a figure. Not a shadow, not a trick of the light. A man. Or at least, something that used to be a man. His uniform was old, tattered, stained with something dark. His face was barely visible beneath the brim of his cap, but I could see his mouth, twisted into something that might have once been a smile. The train was almost at the platform. I was out of time. Then the voice came through my radio again, clearer than ever before. Run! My body finally obeyed. I turned and sprinted toward the stairs, the sound of the train filling my head. The lights overhead shattered as I ran, plunging the station into near darkness. The ground shook beneath my feet. My breath came in ragged gasps. I reached the stairs and took them two at a time, gripping the railing so hard my fingers ached. The sound of the train was deafening now. The air was thick with the stench of burning metal, of something old and rotting. And then, silence. I reached the top step and turned back. The platform was empty. The train was gone. But I wasn't alone. The figure stood at the far end of the station, motionless, watching me. And then, as if dissolving into the shadows, he vanished. I didn't move for a long time. I just stood there, staring at the empty tracks, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Then, finally, I turned and left. And I never went back. I didn't go to work the next night, or the night after that. I called in sick, though I knew that wouldn't hold up for long. I wasn't sick, not in the way they think. But after what I saw, after what I heard, there was no way I could step foot underground again. The worst part was trying to convince myself it hadn't happened. That maybe I had imagined it all, that the stress, the exhaustion, the long nights had finally caught up with me. But I knew better. The sound of the train was still with me, even in my apartment. I could hear it at night, distant but steady, rumbling through the walls, rattling my windows. It'd wake up drenched in sweat, convinced the whole building was shaking. I tried to ignore it. I couldn't. Even in broad daylight, I saw flashes of movement in my peripheral vision, just at the edge of my sight. Shadows that didn't belong. A figure standing too still in the reflection of a passing window. And the radio static? It never really stopped. I left my work-issued radio in my locker before I bailed, but my phone started acting up. Every so often, when I made a call or played a video, the sound would distort, crackle, break, slip into that same awful static. And once, in the middle of the night, when I picked up my phone to check the time, the screen flickered. For less than a second, just long enough for my sleep-addled brain to register, I saw something. A train! A single frame, like a glitch in reality. Rusted metal, fogged windows. And him, the conductor, standing in the doorway, looking right at me. I didn't sleep that night. Eventually, I stopped answering calls from my supervisor, stopped checking my emails. I couldn't go back down there. I knew that if I did, I wouldn't come back. I wasn't the only one affected, though. One of my coworkers, a guy who had been on shift that night, quit out of nowhere. No explanation, no goodbye. Just never came back. The others? They pretended nothing had happened. At least, that's what they said. But I could see it in their eyes when I ran into them on the street. They weren't sleeping either. No one wanted to admit it, but we all knew the truth. Something was still down there, and it was waiting. I moved away not long after that. It wasn't an easy decision. I had spent years working for the subway, and it had been my livelihood. But after everything I had seen, after the nights filled with static and the glimpses of something that shouldn't exist, I knew I had to go. The city wasn't safe for me anymore. I packed my things and took the first job I could find in another state. It didn't pay as well, but I didn't care. I just needed to be away from the tunnels, the rails, the sounds of something coming that never should. For a while, it seemed to work. The sounds faded. The static stopped. The nightmares came less frequently. But even now, I'm never really sure if it's over. Some nights when I'm walking home late, I catch the faintest sound in the distance, a low rumbling, like a train on tracks that shouldn't be there. Sometimes, when I flip through radio stations, there's a split second of dead air, then static, then silence. And sometimes, just for a moment, I see him, in the reflection of a passing train, standing at the end of a platform I know isn't there, watching, waiting. And I know, deep down, that no matter how far I run, the phantom train will always find me. This story takes place a few years ago when I worked the night shift as a caretaker for an old office building in a quiet part of town. I had taken the job for the solitude, the steady paycheck, and honestly, because it seemed easy. At night, the building was empty, just me, a few security cameras, and the occasional maintenance worker who would come by to check on the plumbing or heating systems. The building itself had a long history. It was one of those places that had changed hands over the years, originally built as a factory in the early 1900s, later converted into office spaces sometime in the late 80s. Despite the renovations, some parts of the building still carried an eerie, forgotten feel. The basement, for example, was mostly unused except for old storage, and the top floor had a section that had been abandoned due to safety concerns. I worked 5 nights a week, arriving at 10 p.m. and leaving at 6 a.m. My responsibilities were simple: make rounds every couple of hours, ensure all doors were locked, check the security feed, and report anything unusual. Most nights, nothing happened. The silence would stretch on for hours, broken only by the distant hum of traffic or the occasional gust of wind rattling the windows. At first, the emptiness was comforting. I liked being alone with my thoughts, sipping coffee while watching grainy security footage. But the longer I worked there, the more I started to notice small things that didn't make sense. For the first few weeks, my shifts were quiet. The building was old, but aside from the occasional creak of settling wood or the distant sound of pipe shifting, nothing out of the ordinary happened. I went about my routine without issue, making rounds, checking doors, and watching security footage with half-hearted attention. It wasn't exciting, but it was predictable. I liked predictable. Then, one night, something small, almost insignificant, caught my attention. It was a little after 2 a.m., and I was sitting in the main security office, a cramped room filled with outdated monitors displaying grainy black and white feeds of different parts of the building. Most of the screens showed nothing but empty hallways and locked offices. But as I scanned the footage, my eyes landed on the camera feed for the third floor corridor, one of the areas I had just checked about an hour before. There was a door at the end of that hallway, an old wooden one that led to a storage room nobody used anymore. It was always locked. Always. But now, on the screen in front of me, the door was slightly open. I frowned, leaning closer to make sure I wasn't imagining it. The camera quality wasn't great, but I could see the door had shifted, maybe just an inch or two, but enough to notice. My first thought was that I had made a mistake during my rounds. Maybe I hadn't checked it properly. Maybe the lock was faulty and it had swung open on its own. I grabbed my flashlight, clipped my radio to my belt, and headed out of the office. The building was silent as I made my way up the stairs, my footsteps echoing slightly in the empty space. The third floor was always a little colder than the others, probably something to do with the old insulation. As I walked down the hallway, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above me, casting long shadows against the walls. When I reached the storage room door, I hesitated. It was definitely open wider than it had been in the camera feed, just a few inches, but enough for someone to squeeze through. I pulled out my keys and pushed the door open all the way. The storage room was small, filled with old office chairs, metal filing cabinets, and boxes stacked against the walls. Dust hung in the air, and the dim overhead light flickered slightly when I switched it on. I stepped inside, shining my flashlight around, half expecting to find an animal or maybe some maintenance worker who had forgotten to lock up. But the room was empty. Still, something felt off. I moved toward the back of the room, checking behind the stacks of boxes, making sure no one was hiding. Nothing. But as I turned to leave, my foot brushed against something on the floor, a single sheet of paper, yellowed with age, lying just inside the doorway. I bent down to pick it up. It was a building report, dated over 20 years ago. Most of the writing was faded, but I could make out a few words, something about structural concerns and restricted access to certain areas. I flipped the page over, expecting to find more, but that was when I saw it. Faintly, almost as if it had been scrawled hastily, there was a message on the back of the paper. Do not go upstairs. A chill ran through me. I stared at the words, my mind racing. Was this some kind of old note left behind by a former worker? A joke? Some kind of warning? I didn't know. I put the paper back where I found it, locked the storage room door, and returned to my office. I checked the security feed again, expecting to see the door still open, but it was closed, just like I had left it. For the rest of the night, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in my chest. It was probably nothing, I told myself. Just an old building doing old building things. But part of me, some small, nagging part, knew that wasn't the case. And soon, things would only get worse. For a while, I tried to convince myself that the open storage room door and the note were just random occurrences, something I had overlooked or some long-forgotten prank. But after that night, the building felt different. The quiet that I had once found comforting now felt unnatural, like something was waiting just beyond my line of sight. It started with small things. One night, I was making my usual rounds when I heard something that stopped me in my tracks. I had just checked the second floor break room, making sure the doors were locked when I heard footsteps. Not mine, someone else's. They were coming from the floor above me. I stood there for a moment, straining to listen, hoping I was mistaken. But the sound was clear, slow, deliberate steps moving across the ceiling, right above where I stood. I reached for my radio, ready to call security, but then the footsteps stopped. I waited. Silence! I told myself it was probably the old pipe shifting, or maybe the building settling, but the sound had been too distinct, too human. I climbed the stairs, my flashlight cutting through the dimly lit hallway, and stepped on to the third floor. Empty. I walked the length of the corridor, checking every door. All locked. I even checked the security feed when I got back to my office, rewinding the footage from that camera angle. Nothing. The next few nights, the footsteps returned. Always around the same time, between 2 and 3 a.m., slow and steady, as if someone was pacing just above me. It never lasted long, just long enough to make my skin crawl. Then, one night, something changed. It was just past 3 a.m., and I had finished checking the ground floor when I heard the footsteps again. This time, they weren't coming from above. They were coming from the same floor I was on. I stood still, barely breathing. The sound was faint but unmistakable, someone walking slowly down the hallway behind me. I turned, my flashlight sweeping the corridor. The air felt heavier, thick with something I couldn't name. I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the silence. No response. I took a few steps forward, the beam of my flashlight flickering slightly as I moved. I was about to turn the corner when the sound stopped abruptly, like whoever or whatever it was had realized I was following. The hallway was empty. I walked the length of the corridor, checking each door again, but everything was as it should be. No signs of forced entry, no open doors. I checked the security feed as soon as I got back to my office. My hands were clammy as I rewound the footage, scanning the cameras for any sign of movement. Then I saw it. On the screen, just for a brief moment, a shadow moved at the very edge of the frame. It was barely noticeable, but it was there, something shifting just outside the camera's view. I rewound the footage and watched again. The movement was subtle, but it was enough to make my stomach tighten. The worst part, the shadow had been standing right where I had just been. I leaned back in my chair, my pulse pounding in my ears. I knew I should report it, call for backup, or at least do another sweep of the building. But something about it made me hesitate. Instead, I kept watching the footage, scanning for any other signs of movement. Then, just as I was about to give up, something else caught my eye. The storage room door, the same one that had been opened the week before, was slightly ajar again. I hadn't touched it. I grabbed my flashlight and set out once more, my legs feeling heavier with every step. When I reached the third floor, the hallway felt colder than before. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, flickering just enough to make me feel like I was seeing movement where there was none. The storage room door was open a few inches, just like before. I stepped forward, pushing it open fully, my flashlight sweeping across the dusty room. The boxes were still there, the furniture untouched. But something was different. On the floor, just inside the door, was another sheet of paper. I bent down and picked it up. This one was blank. At least, that's what I thought at first. But when I tilted it under the dim light, I saw faint indentations, like someone had written on the paper and then removed the top sheet. I rubbed my fingers across the surface, my breath catching in my throat. It was the same handwriting as before. And this time, the message was shorter. You're not alone. I dropped the paper and stepped back, my pulse hammering against my ribs. A sudden creak behind me made my skin prickle. I spun around, shining my flashlight toward the door. The hallway was empty, but the air felt different, like something had just been there, watching. I locked the storage room door again and hurried back to my office, my hands shaking as I checked the security feed. Nothing had changed. No shadows, no movement, just an empty hallway. But I knew, deep in my gut, I wasn't imagining this. Something was in that building with me, and it was getting closer. For the next few nights, I barely slept. Even when I wasn't working, my mind kept replaying the security footage, the footsteps, the open storage room door. The message, you're not alone. It had been 3 nights since I found that note, and things were only getting worse. The footsteps no longer stopped when I turned on my flashlight. They didn't even hesitate when I called out. I could hear them behind me, around me, sometimes even in the stairwell when I was climbing up. I started carrying my radio with me at all times, but every time I thought about calling someone, I hesitated. What could I even say? There's something in the building with me. Even to myself, it sounded ridiculous. But then came the night that changed everything. It was just after 2:30 a.m., and I was on the second floor, finishing my usual round. I had been avoiding the storage room since the last incident, but tonight I forced myself to pass by. I needed to prove to myself that it was just an old building, that my mind was playing tricks on me. As I walked down the dim hallway, the overhead lights buzzed faintly. I could hear my own breathing, steady but shallow. My footsteps echoed as I neared the door. And then, a soft sound. Not footsteps. Breathing. I stopped so suddenly my own breath caught in my throat. The sound wasn't coming from me. It was coming from the other side of the storage room door. Slow, ragged, like someone trying to stay quiet but failing. I took a step back, my heart hammering so hard I felt it in my throat. My fingers fumbled for my radio. I had to call someone. Anyone. But then, the door handle turned. My breath itched. The handle didn't just shake, it twisted, as if someone on the other side was about to push the door open. I took another step back, gripping my flashlight so tightly my knuckles ached. My radio was in my other hand, but I couldn't force myself to speak. Then, the door creaked open an inch. A wave of cold air hit me, unnatural and thick, like the room beyond was swallowing all the warmth from the hallway. I raised my flashlight, aiming it straight into the dark gap. Nothing. No movement. But the breathing, oh God, the breathing was still there. It was coming from inside the room, deep and raspy, inches away from where I stood. And then, slowly, so damn slowly, the door opened wider. My instinct screamed at me to run, to get out, but my legs refused to move. My body was locked in place, frozen in that moment of sheer terror. Then, something happened that sent ice straight through my veins. From the darkness, something whispered. A single, hoarse word. Leave! I felt my knees buckle. My radio slipped from my grasp, hitting the floor with a sharp crack. Then, the door slammed shut. I don't remember how I moved, but the next thing I knew, I was running, sprinting down the hallway, my flashlight bouncing wildly. I didn't stop until I reached my office, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely pick up my radio from where it had landed on the floor. I fumbled to turn on the security feed, my breath coming in short, uneven gasps. My entire body felt like it was on fire, a cold sweat clinging to my skin. I rewound the footage, staring at the camera that faced the storage room. At first, there was nothing. Then, the door opened. On the screen, I saw it move, slowly, just like it had in front of me. But there was no one there. No hand on the handle. No shadow passing through the doorway. Nothing. Then, right before the door slammed shut, the feed glitched. For less than a second, a shape appeared on the screen. It wasn't clear, just a blur, a distortion of static and darkness, but I felt it as if it were standing behind me, watching over my shoulder. I hit pause, staring at the frozen frame. The shape had eyes. Two pale, hollow pits where human eyes should have been. And in that moment, I knew this thing, whatever it was, had been here the whole time. Watching me, following me, waiting. And now it had made itself known. I couldn't stay here anymore. I grabbed my things, barely able to keep my hands steady, and ran for the exit. But as I reached the stairwell, I heard it. A voice, whispering from somewhere too close. You should have left sooner. I didn't look back. I ran. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping in the freezing night air. The building loomed behind me, dark and silent, but I knew that whatever was inside wasn't going to stay hidden anymore. It had been patient, but now it wanted me to know it was real. And worst of all, it wanted me to know it wasn't finished. I stood outside the building, sucking in cold air, trying to steady my breath. My hands were still trembling, my heart pounding so violently that I thought I might pass out. The street was empty, silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves against the pavement. But inside, in that dimly lit hallway, something waited. I looked down at my radio, still clenched in my fingers. My first thought was to call my boss to report what had happened. But how could I explain it? That I had seen something that shouldn't be possible? That a voice had whispered to me from an empty room? Would they even believe me? I knew the answer. Instead, I stood there, staring at the front entrance, torn between two instincts, one telling me to run, to never step foot inside that place again, and the other, more dangerous one, urging me to go back in, to confront it. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but after a few minutes, my feet started moving, back toward the entrance, back toward the thing that had been watching me. I reached the front doors, hesitated for a fraction of a second, and then pushed them open. The lobby was exactly as I had left it, silent, sterile, and cold. The soft hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a sound that now felt almost mocking. My office was down the hall, but I didn't go there. Instead, I turned toward the stairwell. I had to know. I had to see. Each step felt heavier than the last as I climbed the stairs to the second floor. My flashlight flickered slightly as I walked down the hallway toward the storage room. And then I stopped. The door was open. Not just slightly ajar like before, but wide open, revealing the pitch black interior. The air coming from inside was wrong. Heavy, thick. My breath was shallow as I stepped closer, shining my light inside. The shelves were the same. The dusty equipment was the same. But there was something different. Something that made my stomach twist painfully. A new piece of paper was sitting in the middle of the floor. I swallowed hard, every nerve in my body screaming at me to turn around, to walk away. But I didn't. I stepped inside. The air was ice cold, making my breath visible as I bent down and picked up the paper. My fingers trembled as I turned it over. There were only 2 words written in the same jagged handwriting as before. Still here. I didn't even have time to react before I felt it. The presence, right behind me. I spun around so fast that my flashlight nearly slipped from my grip. But there was nothing. No one. Just the empty room and the silent hallway beyond. I backed away, never taking my eyes off the doorway. My pulse was hammering in my ears. Every part of me was screaming to leave now. And this time, I listened. I turned, sprinted down the hall, and didn't stop until I was outside again, gasping in the cold air. That was it. I was done. I pulled out my phone and called my supervisor. I didn't care how it sounded anymore. I just said I was sick, that I couldn't finish my shift. And I never went back. I quit the next morning. I didn't even collect my last paycheck. I never wanted to step foot in that building again. For weeks, I tried to convince myself that it was my imagination, that stress and exhaustion had gotten to me. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something was there, and it had been waiting for me to notice it. A month later, I got a call. It was my old coworker, another night security guard. At first, we made small talk, but then he got quiet. And then he asked, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, "Did anything strange ever happen to you in there?" I didn't say anything. I didn't need to, because I already knew what he was going to say. It was still there. And now it had found someone new. I haven't set foot in that building since the night I left. I don't even drive past it. Something about the thought of seeing it again, just the outside of it, sends an uneasy feeling through my gut. Like it would recognize me. Like it would know. For weeks after I quit, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. That slow, deliberate pace. That feeling of being watched. Even in my own apartment, I felt like I wasn't alone. At first, I chalked it up to paranoia. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, lingering fears from that night. But then, things started to happen. Little things. A door I swore I had shut would be open in the morning. My keys would go missing, only to show up somewhere I knew I had left them. The worst part? The whispers. Late at night, when everything was quiet, I could almost hear them. Not words, not something I could fully understand, but they were there. Some nights, I would wake up gasping for breath, feeling like something had been standing over me, watching, waiting. My apartment no longer felt like my own. It felt wrong. I moved 6 months later. I packed up everything I owned and left, not telling anyone why. My friends thought I was just restless, that I needed a change of scenery. But I knew the truth. I wasn't running from a place. I was running from whatever followed me. It's been years now. Most nights, I sleep fine. Most days, I don't think about that building, that hallway, that storage room. But every once in a while, something reminds me. A footstep in an empty house. A shadow that doesn't quite move the way it should. A cold breath of air in a room with no open windows. And in those moments, I remember what I already know deep down. I may have left that building, but whatever was in there, it never left me. There's a certain stillness to the countryside that makes it feel untouched, like time forgot about it. I grew up in a small town nestled between rolling hills and endless stretches of farmland. Life moved at its own pace there, predictable and quiet. People worked, kids rode their bikes through the dusty roads, and every Sunday, families gathered at the only diner in town for breakfast. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's business, and the biggest excitement was when the occasional traveler got lost and stopped at the gas station to ask for directions. But just beyond the town, hidden between dense forests and winding back roads, there was the dam. It wasn't just any dam. It was massive, old, and intimidating. It loomed over the valley, its waters stretching out like an endless mirror, swallowing the trees at its edges. People rarely talked about it, not because it was some forbidden place, but because it was just there, a part of the landscape that nobody really questioned. It had been built decades ago, flooding an old village in the process, but most people didn't think about what lay beneath the surface. I was 17 when I started working for the county's maintenance crew. It was a summer job, something to make a little money before my final year of high school. The work wasn't glamorous, mostly fixing roads, clearing brush, and making sure the dam spillways weren't clogged with debris. The crew was made up of local guys, most of them in their late 40s or 50s, men who had been doing this kind of work since they were my age. They liked to joke around, teasing me for being the youngest and sticking me with the worst task. But I didn't mind. It was better than spending the summer stuck at home. Every morning, we'd meet at the maintenance shed by the dam before heading out. The building was old and smelled like oil and wet concrete, its walls lined with rusting tools and shelves stacked with faded binders full of handwritten reports. There was always a coffee pot brewing in the corner, though the coffee was so thick and bitter that I learned to avoid it. The foreman, a gruff man with a permanent squint from years spent working in the sun, would hand out assignments, and we'd load up the trucks with whatever we needed for the day. I got paired with an older guy named Henry most days. He was quiet but not unfriendly, the kind of man who spoke only when necessary. He knew every inch of the dam, from the control room to the spillway tunnels beneath it. He never said much about it, but there was something in the way he looked at the water, like it unsettled him. The dam had a reputation, not in the way that old houses are rumored to be haunted, but in a quieter, more insidious way. People talked about odd things happening near it, strange noises at night, shadows moving beneath the surface of the water, a feeling of being watched. Fishermen sometimes claimed their boats would drift when there was no wind, and a few even swore they'd seen figures standing on the edge of the dam in the middle of the night, only for them to vanish when they got closer. But those were just stories, the kind that small towns create to give a place an identity. I had never believed in ghosts or curses. The way I saw it, the dam was just a massive structure built to control water, nothing more. That summer, the lake was lower than usual, exposing parts of the old village that had been swallowed by the reservoir decades ago. Usually, it stayed hidden beneath the surface, but now, remnants of the past were beginning to resurface. Foundation stones, rusted metal fixtures, the outlines of what had once been streets. Henry didn't like it. "Should have stayed buried," he muttered one day as we stood near the water's edge, looking down at the half-submerged remains of an old house. I remember laughing it off. "Come on, it's just history." He didn't respond. He just turned and walked back toward the truck, shaking his head. At first, I thought it was just superstition. Older folks in town always talked about the past, like it still had some hold on the present. But as the weeks went by, little things started to happen, things I couldn't explain, things that made me wonder if Henry was right. The first time I felt something was wrong, it wasn't anything obvious. It was just a feeling, one of those nagging sensations at the back of your mind that you can't quite shake. At first, I ignored it. After all, the dam was just a place, and despite the stories, I had never seen or heard anything to convince me otherwise. That changed one late afternoon. Henry and I had spent most of the day clearing debris from the lower spillways. The lake's water level had dropped enough that parts of the dam's infrastructure, usually hidden, were now exposed. The town didn't seem too concerned about it, at least not yet, but our job was to make sure nothing clogged the system. If too much debris built up, the pressure could weaken the dam structure, and nobody wanted that. We were finishing up when I noticed something strange. The water, usually calm near the spillway, had started to ripple, not from the wind, but from something below the surface. It wasn't just a single disturbance, it was rhythmic, like something was moving beneath the water, sending out small, deliberate waves. At first, I figured it was a fish or some debris shifting under the current, but as I watched, I realized the ripples weren't random. They spread outward in perfect, concentric rings, pulsing like a heartbeat. I frowned and nudged Henry. "Hey, look at that." He followed my gaze, squinting. The lines on his weathered face deepened. "Get your stuff," he muttered. "We're done for the day." I hesitated. "What do you think it is?" Henry didn't answer right away. Instead, he grabbed the coil of rope we had been using and slung it over his shoulder. Water does strange things. Don't stare at it too long. That wasn't the kind of response I was hoping for. I expected something practical, maybe a scientific explanation about underwater currents or pressure shifts. But Henry's tone wasn't casual. It was the kind of voice people use when they don't want to talk about something. I tried to laugh it off. You sound like one of those old guys at the diner. Henry still didn't look at me. Maybe they know something you don't. That stuck with me. Later that evening, I found myself thinking about the ripples. I had never seen water behave like that before, at least not without something causing it. And yet, I hadn't seen anything beneath the surface. No fish, no debris, nothing. Just water shifting in a way that didn't make sense. I told myself I was overthinking it. But the next day, it happened again. We had been assigned to check the intake tunnels, a job I hated. The tunnels ran underneath the dam, funneling water toward the turbines. They were massive, dark, and loud, with the constant sound of rushing water echoing off the concrete walls. The air inside was thick with moisture, and even in the summer heat, it was always cold down there. Henry and I took the metal stairs leading down to the tunnel. The maintenance lights flickered as we moved, casting long shadows along the damp concrete walls. The deeper we went, the stronger the smell of stagnant water became. I had been down there a handful of times before, and I never liked it. There was something about the way sound carried through the tunnels, distorting everything, making it feel like there was someone or something just around the corner, waiting. As we reached the bottom platform, Henry pulled out a flashlight and swept it along the water's edge. The surface was eerily still, barely disturbed by the flow moving through the intake grates. We were supposed to check for blockages, branches, trash, anything that might obstruct the flow. I leaned over the railing, scanning the grates below. That was when I saw it. A shape just beneath the water. At first, I thought it was a shadow, but as Henry moved the flashlight, the shape didn't shift like a shadow should. It was motionless, just beyond the reach of the beam, its edges blurred by the water. I opened my mouth to say something, but before I could, the shape moved. Not in a way that water moves, not like debris getting caught in a current. It shifted, deliberately, pulling back into the darkness of the tunnel like it knew it was being watched. A chill ran down my spine. Did you see that? Henry turned, his expression unreadable. What? There was something down there. A shadow, or... I stopped myself, shaking my head. I don't know. Henry didn't react the way I expected. He didn't laugh it off or try to explain it away. He just looked at me for a long moment before finally saying, "Let's go." I hesitated. But we're supposed to. We're done here. That was the first time I saw real unease on Henry's face. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shape beneath the water, that slow, deliberate movement as it retreated into the shadows. It didn't feel like an animal. It didn't feel like anything natural. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things. Maybe it was just debris after all, something caught in the flow, making it seem like it moved on its own. But I couldn't shake the way Henry had reacted. He had seen something too, and he didn't want to talk about it. The next few days were quiet. I went about my work as usual, clearing brush, patching up small cracks in the concrete, doing everything I could to keep my mind off what I had seen. But then, something else happened. I was assigned to check one of the smaller control rooms near the dam's edge. It was an old structure, built decades ago, with rusting pipes and walls covered in peeling paint. The control panels inside were ancient, their dials and switches worn smooth from years of use. Most of the readings were automated now, but someone still had to come down and make sure everything was functioning properly. The room itself wasn't anything special. What was outside of it was. As I stepped out, I noticed something in the dirt just beyond the concrete walkway. Footprints. That wouldn't have been strange on its own. Plenty of people walked through the area. But these weren't normal footprints. They were spaced unevenly, as if whoever made them had been dragging their feet, and they led directly to the water. I followed them, my heart pounding harder with each step. The prints got fainter the closer they got to the reservoir's edge, disappearing just before the shoreline. There were no prints leading back. I stood there for a long time, staring at the water. It was still and undisturbed, as if nothing had entered it at all. But I knew what I saw. Someone, or something, had walked straight into the reservoir and never came back out. That was the moment I started to believe that something was wrong with the dam. Henry had been right. Some things should have stayed buried. After the footprints, I started seeing things differently. It wasn't just an old dam anymore. It wasn't just water. It was something else, something that had been there all along, watching, waiting. And whatever it was getting bolder. I told myself I wouldn't let my mind play tricks on me, that I wouldn't fall into the same paranoia that had clearly taken hold of Henry. But the problem was, the dam wasn't letting me ignore it anymore. The strange things kept happening. They weren't loud, dramatic events, not at first. They were small, almost subtle, like a quiet reminder that something was off. Tools went missing from the storage shed, only to show up somewhere else, somewhere I knew I hadn't left them. Water levels would shift overnight, even though the control log showed no changes to the system. One morning, I came in to find the maintenance checklist already filled out. My name was on it. The times, the signatures, all in my handwriting. But I hadn't been there the night before. That's when I stopped trying to explain things away. That's when I started paying attention. I decided to go back to the tunnels. I told myself I needed to check something, that it was just routine maintenance. But the truth was, I couldn't get the shadow out of my mind. I needed to see it again. I needed to prove that there was something down there. I waited until late evening, when most of the other workers had gone home. Henry had already left for the night, and I didn't tell him I was staying. If I had, he would have told me not to go back down there. The metal stairs groaned under my boots as I descended into the lower levels of the dam. The air grew colder with each step, thick with the damp scent of mildew and stagnant water. The maintenance lights flickered, casting brief flashes of brightness before leaving long stretches of darkness. I reached the bottom and turned on my flashlight. The intake tunnel stretched ahead, the water below black and still. The sound of rushing water echoed through the concrete chambers, bouncing in a way that made it impossible to tell where it was actually coming from. I moved closer to the railing, gripping the flashlight tightly. My breath felt loud in the confined space. I scanned the water, searching for any sign of movement. At first, there was nothing. Then, the light caught something. At the far end of the tunnel, just at the edge of the concrete platform, something was standing in the water. I froze. It wasn't a shadow this time. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was a figure. The shape was wrong. Its proportions were off, stretched too long, too thin. The water barely rippled around it, as if it wasn't really there. I couldn't see a face. I couldn't see anything except the outline of something that shouldn't have been there. Then it moved. Not toward me, away. It slipped backward into the darkness of the tunnel, fading into the shadows like it had never been there at all. I don't remember running back up the stairs. All I remember is Henry's voice when I found him the next morning. "You saw it, didn't you?" I didn't bother asking how he knew. Instead, I sat down across from him at the worksite and told him everything about the footprints, the missing tools, the maintenance log I never filled out, and the thing I had seen in the tunnel. Henry listened without interrupting. When I finished, he sighed. "You should quit." I scoffed. "That's your answer?" "I'm serious," he said. "You don't want to know what's down there. You don't want to start asking questions. The dam doesn't like questions." I stared at him. What the hell does that mean? Henry rubbed a hand over his face, looking more exhausted than I had ever seen him. It means, he said, that this place wasn't built the way people think it was. I pushed him for more. He hesitated at first, but eventually he told me what he knew. The dam was old, older than the town liked to admit. Officially, construction started in the late 1940s, but Henry said there were stories that something had been here before the dam. Something that wasn't supposed to be disturbed. I wanted to believe he was just spouting conspiracy theories, but after what I had seen, I wasn't so sure. People went missing when they built this place, Henry said. Not a lot, not enough to make the history books, but enough. Bodies? I asked. No, Henry said. No bodies. They just disappeared. I didn't quit. Maybe I should have, but I needed to know the truth. Over the next few nights, I stayed late, watching the water. Every time, I saw something. Sometimes it was a shadow moving where nothing should be. Other times, I saw the ripples again, that same rhythmic pulse, like something breathing beneath the surface. One night, I brought a camera. I set it up near the intake tunnel, pointed it toward the water, and left it recording. I didn't stay to watch this time. Instead, I locked up and went home, determined to review the footage with fresh eyes in the morning. When I checked the camera the next day, my stomach turned to ice. The footage was mostly still, nothing but water and concrete. But at exactly 2:43 a.m., something changed. The water shifted. Not a splash, not a ripple, just a slow, pulling movement, like something beneath the surface was rising. Then the camera cut to static. It stayed that way for the next 5 minutes. When the feed returned, the water was still again. But the camera had moved. It was no longer pointed at the intake tunnel. It was facing the stairs, facing the spot where I had been standing the night before. Like something had been watching me. Like something new. I went to Henry that morning and showed him the footage. He didn't even watch the whole thing. He just shut the laptop and shook his head. I told you, he said. The dam doesn't like questions. I looked at him, my pulse pounding in my ears. Then what does it want? Henry's face was green. I don't know, but I know what it takes. I swallowed hard. And what's that? Henry met my eyes. People. I should have left then. I should have packed up my things, walked off the job, and never looked back. But I didn't, because the dam wasn't done with me yet. And soon I would find out exactly what it had been hiding beneath the water all along. Henry's words stayed with me long after our conversation ended. I don't know, but I know what it takes. People. I wanted to pretend he was wrong, that he was just some paranoid old man spouting all superstitions. But I had seen too much. I had felt too much. And I couldn't ignore what had happened to the camera. Something had moved it. Something had watched me. And I knew, without a doubt, that if I didn't find out the truth, he'd never be able to leave this place behind. That night, I went back to the tunnels. I told myself I was just going to check one last time. Just a final look. Then he'd leave, turn in my resignation, and walk away from this place forever. I didn't bring a camera this time. I didn't need proof anymore. I needed answers. The air was thick with moisture as I stepped onto the metal staircase. Each step echoed, the sound swallowed by the oppressive silence below. The dim maintenance lights flickered, casting shifting shadows along the walls. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness as I reached the lower platform. The intake tunnel stretched ahead, the black water still as ever. I gripped the railing, my breath unsteady. "All right," I muttered. "I know you're here." My voice barely made a dent in the silence. I waited. Nothing. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to step closer to the water's edge. Then the air changed. It was subtle at first, like a shift in pressure, a weight settling over my shoulders. My skin prickled. My ears popped. The fine hairs on my arms stood on end. Then the water moved. Not a ripple, not a splash. Something rose. A shape, dark and unnatural, began to emerge from the depths. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by my flashlight, but then it kept rising. Higher and higher. And then I saw them. Faces. Dozens of them. Pale. Twisted. Mouths open in silent screams. They weren't floating. They weren't bodies. They were part of whatever was coming out of the water. A massive, writhing form, shifting and pulsing like it was made of liquid and flesh all at once. The faces contorted, shifting in and out of sight, some fading back into the mass, while others pushed forward, as if struggling to escape. I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat. The thing kept rising, its shape impossible to comprehend, both solid and fluid, both dead and alive. Then I saw the eyes. Two hollow, sunken voids, darker than anything I had ever seen. And they were looking at me. My legs refused to move. My mind screamed at me to run, but I was rooted to the spot, trapped in the suffocating weight of that gaze. Then, a sound. A low, wet groan that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The air turned ice cold. And then, the faces spoke. Not in words. Not in anything human. But I understood. Stay! A hand shot out from the mass, long skeletal fingers reaching for me. That was enough to break whatever hold it had over me. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I was out of the tunnels, my lungs burning, my heartbeat slamming in my ears. I nearly collapsed when I reached the surface, falling against the chain-link fence that lined the dam's perimeter. The night air was thick, heavy, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't shake. Then I heard something behind me. Footsteps. I spun around, my pulse hammering. Henry stood there, his face unreadable. You saw it, didn't you? He said quietly. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. He let out a slow breath and walked past me, staring down at the water. It's not just the dam, he said. It's the whole town, the whole valley. I swallowed hard, my throat raw. What the hell is it? Henry didn't look at me. You already know. The dam wasn't built to stop the water. It was built to contain something. And whatever it wasn't done. Not yet. Not with me. I don't remember driving home that night. My mind was too scattered, too overloaded with what I had just seen. One moment, I was standing near the dam, Henry's words still sinking in. The next, I was in my apartment, sitting on the floor with my hands buried in my hair, staring at nothing. I couldn't shake the image from my mind. That thing. The faces. The way they shifted, melted, reformed. The way they looked at me. But I wasn't. Because even here, far away from the tunnels, far from the black water, I still felt it. Watching. Waiting. And worst of all, I couldn't convince myself that I was safe. I called work the next morning and quit. No notice. No explanation. Just as simple, I won't be coming back. My supervisor didn't seem surprised. You're not the first, he said. Won't be the last. That sent a fresh wave of dread through me. How many others had seen what I saw? How many didn't make it out? And how many had, but carried it with them, just like I was now? I didn't ask. I didn't want to know. I just hung up, packed a bag, and got in my car. I needed to leave. Not just the dam, not just the job, the entire town. I didn't have a plan, didn't care where I ended up. I just drove. I thought maybe if I got far enough, if I put enough distance between myself and that cursed place, I could shake it, that I could forget, that I could move on. But it didn't work. It followed me. The first time, I woke up gasping for air, my sheets damp with sweat. I had dreamed of water. Not just water. The water. Dark. heavy, pressing against my skin, filling my lungs, dragging me down. And the faces, they were there, too, watching me, reaching for me, whispering in a language I couldn't understand, but somehow still felt in my bones. When I finally calmed down, I turned on the bedside lamp, needing the reassurance of light. That's when I saw them, wet footprints, leading from my bed to the doorway. I didn't sleep after that. It got worse. I started seeing things in reflective surfaces, not just shadows, not just flickers of movement in the corner of my eye. I saw them, their hollow eyes, their stretched mouths, their sunken, waterlogged faces, watching me, waiting. Every time I turned, they were gone, but the feeling remained. I stopped looking in mirrors, stopped using anything with a reflection. It didn't help, because it wasn't just reflections anymore. It was in the corners of rooms. It was outside my windows at night. It was in the sound of water dripping when no faucet had been turned on. I started hearing the groan, the same one from the tunnels. That deep, wet, wrong sound. It would come at random times, just a low vibration at first, like a distant rumble of thunder. Then closer, louder, until it was right behind me. Every single time I turned, and every single time, there was nothing there. But I knew it was getting closer. I stopped running, stopped trying to escape, because there was nothing left to escape to. I knew now. It wasn't just the dam. It wasn't just the town. Whatever was beneath that water, it had already gotten out. It had already taken me, and it wasn't going to let me go. I don't know when I stopped fighting. Maybe it was the first time I woke up to the sound of water rushing in my ears, only to find myself lying in a dry bed, soaked to the bone with no explanation. Maybe it was when I finally accepted that the whispers weren't just in my head, that they were real, surrounding me, pressing in from places I couldn't see but could feel. Or maybe it was the moment I realized that no matter how far I went, no matter how much I tried to leave it behind, the water had already taken something from me, something that I couldn't get back. I started avoiding people, not because I wanted to, but because I had to. They noticed the changes, the dark circles under my eyes from nights spent too afraid to sleep, the way I flinched at the sound of running water, the way I went stiff when it rained, my entire body locking up as if expecting something to reach for me from the puddles forming at my feet. I didn't know how to explain it to them. How do you tell someone that the water is alive? That it's watching? That it wants something? They wouldn't believe me. I wouldn't have believed me either. It's been months now. I don't dream of drowning anymore. That should feel like a relief, but it isn't, because the dreams have changed. Now, I dream that I'm standing at the edge of the dam again, looking down at the dark water below. The surface is still, too still. It doesn't ripple, doesn't move. Then, something breaks through. A hand, bloated, waterlogged, fingers stretched too long, the skin pale and wrinkled like it's been in the water for too long. Then another, and another. One by one, they rise from beneath, reaching, not to pull me under, not to drag me down, but to welcome me back. And I want to go. The worst part is, I want to go. I wake up shaking, but the feeling lingers. The pull, the need, like the water is in my blood now, like it's calling me home. I stopped running, stopped pretending I could fight it, stopped pretending I even wanted to fight it. Because the truth is, I don't think I ever escaped that night at the dam. Not really. Something stayed with me. Something changed in me. And maybe I've always known how this would end. Maybe I was never supposed to leave. Maybe I was only ever meant to return. So if you're watching this, if you've made it this far, I have one last thing to say. Stay away from the dam. Don't look at the water. Don't listen to it. And whatever you do, never, ever let it know your name. Because once it does, it will never let you go. It was late September, the kind of time when the air turns crisp and the leaves start piling along the roads like nature's warning that summer is long gone. I had been drowning in work, barely keeping up with deadlines, and I knew I needed a break. My best friend, Tom, had been talking about this secluded cabin for weeks, an old rental his uncle used to own before selling it off to some private buyer. Tom was the kind of guy who didn't take no for an answer, always pushing for one last adventure before winter locked us inside. I was skeptical at first. A cabin in the middle of nowhere, with no cell service, sounded like the beginning of every bad horror story I had ever heard. But I caved. Maybe a few nights away from the city would clear my head. That Friday afternoon, we packed up my old SUV and hit the road. Tom rode shotgun, navigating with a printed map since GPS had no chance of working in the mountains. In the back seat sat Liam, an old friend from college, and his younger brother, Owen, who had just turned 21. Owen was still fresh out of school, excited for his first real guy's trip. He had grown up hearing about our weekend getaways, and this was his initiation. The drive was long, about 4 hours deep into the forested hills, and the last stretch was nothing but winding dirt roads, the kind that made you wonder if your car would make it out in one piece. We passed a single gas station about 20 miles back, and after that, nothing, just trees stretching out endlessly on either side. The cabin itself was nothing impressive, a one-story wooden structure with a slanted roof and a porch that creaked under our weight as we stepped onto it. The wood looked damp, like it had been sitting through too many storms without maintenance. A single lantern-style light flickered near the door, weakly illuminating the front steps. Tom pulled out the keys, unlocked the door, and pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick, stale, like the place had been abandoned for years. The living room was simple, an old plaid couch, a few mismatched chairs, and a stone fireplace that looked like it hadn't seen flames in a long time. A set of deer antlers hung above the mantel, the only decoration in the entire space. Owen dropped his bag and laughed. "This is what you guys call a vacation spot?" Tom grinned. "Just wait. It grows on you." The kitchen was small, with an outdated fridge that let out a low hum, the only noise in the entire place. There was a single hallway leading to 3 bedrooms, all with rickety wooden doors that stuck when you tried to open them. Liam and Owen took the room on the left, while Tom and I took the one on the right. There was a third room at the end of the hall, but the door was locked. "Guess that one's off limits," Tom muttered, giving the handle a quick shake before shrugging. The first evening was quiet, just the 4 of us sitting around the fireplace after struggling to get it lit. We cooked a simple dinner, played cards, and talked about everything and nothing. The only sound outside was the occasional rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. It was peaceful. I remember stepping outside for a breath of fresh air before bed. The night was silent, unnaturally so. No wind, no chirping crickets, just stillness. The trees loomed like dark shadows against the sky, and beyond the small clearing where the cabin stood, the woods stretched into endless black. Tom came up beside me, shoving his hands into his jacket pockets. Spooky, huh? I nodded. It's like the whole place is holding its breath. He laughed, shaking his head. Man, you gotta relax. It's just a cabin in the woods. I wanted to believe him. That night, I lay in bed, listening to the old wooden walls groan with the cold. The bed was uncomfortable, the mattress thin, and every time I closed my eyes, I felt like something was just outside the cabin, standing in the darkness, watching. I told myself it was just the quiet playing tricks on me, but something about that silence felt off. The first night passed without any real trouble. If there were sounds outside, I convinced myself they were just the wind or animals moving through the woods. I had barely slept, but by morning, the uneasy feeling from the night before had faded. The daylight made everything feel normal again. Owen was the first one up, digging through the cabinets in the kitchen when I walked in. He looked half awake, his hair a mess. Anything to eat? He asked, yawning. I checked the fridge. Eggs. Not sure how old they are. Tom stumbled and next, stretching his arms. As long as they don't move, we should be good. By the time Liam joined us, we had breakfast going, burnt toast and eggs that tasted slightly off, but were edible. The mood was light, filled with easy conversation. The strange silence from the night before felt like a distant memory. After eating, we decided to take a hike. The cabin was surrounded by thick forest, with only one visible trail leading deeper into the woods. Tom, always the self-proclaimed leader, took the front, followed by Liam and Owen. I walked behind them, hands in my pockets, trying to ignore the creeping feeling that something about this place was wrong. The trees were dense, towering overhead like a natural ceiling. The deeper we went, the quieter it became. The wind barely moved through the branches, and there was no sign of animals, no birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just us and the endless trees. Feels like we're the only ones out here, Owen muttered, looking around. Liam laughed. Isn't that the point? Tom was a few steps ahead when he suddenly stopped. Guys, he said, his voice lower than before. Check this out. We walked up to where he stood, and I felt my stomach tighten. There, just off the path, was something unnatural, something that didn't belong. A wooden structure, built from old splintered logs, stood in the middle of a small clearing. It wasn't a cabin, not even a proper shed. It looked more like a lean-to, but something about it was wrong. The logs weren't stacked neatly, they were twisted, almost haphazardly arranged, with large gaps in between. It looked unstable, like it had been built in a rush, or by someone who didn't care if it collapsed. Owen tilted his head. What is that? Tom stepped closer, examining it. Maybe an old hunting blind? I shook my head. Who would build something like this way out here? Liam walked around to the side. It's empty, he called out. But he stopped mid-sentence, his voice suddenly uncertain. We all moved to where he was standing. There, nailed into one of the logs, were long, deep scratches. Not random ones, deliberate, straight marks, all the same length. Claw marks? Owen asked, frowning. Tom scoffed. From what? A bear? No way, I said. Bears don't make marks that perfect. This looks man-made. Liam reached out, tracing one of the grooves with his fingers. Feels old. Whatever made these, it wasn't recent. We stood there for a long moment, none of us speaking. There was something unnatural about the place, something that made my skin crawl. Tom finally broke the silence. All right, let's keep moving. Owen hesitated. Shouldn't we? What? Tom cut in. It's just an old shack. Who cares? I wasn't convinced, but standing around wouldn't change anything. so we left it behind and kept walking. The rest of the hike was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Every so often, I'd glance over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something watching from the trees. But there was nothing. When we got back to the cabin, the afternoon sun had started to dip. The place looked different in the fading light, more isolated, more foreign. I pushed the thoughts away, chalking it up to my overactive imagination. That night, we built a fire outside. It was supposed to be fun, just us, the open air, and the crackling flames. But something felt off. At first, everything was normal. We sat around, talking and joking. The fire flickered, casting long shadows across the clearing. Then Owen stiffened. "Did you hear that?" We all went quiet, listening. The wind had picked up slightly, rustling the trees. But there was something else, something faint, just at the edge of hearing. A rustling, a shifting, like someone stepping through the underbrush. Tom frowned. Probably just a deer. Owen didn't look convinced. That didn't sound like an animal. Liam shook his head. "Man, you're psyching yourself out. It's nothing." The sound faded, and after a while, the conversation picked up again. But the air felt heavier now, like we had disturbed something. Later that night, when we went inside, I locked the door behind me. I had barely done that before Owen spoke up. "Was the front door open when we got back?" he asked. Tom turned to him. "What?" "When we came back from the hike, wasn't the door open?" Liam frowned. "No, you probably just forgot we left it that way." I glanced at Tom. His expression was unreadable. He was the one who locked up before we left. None of us said anything more, but I noticed that night, when we went to bed, Tom quietly pushed a chair against the front door before turning in. That night was worse than the first. I barely slept. Every time I started to drift off, some small noise would pull me back. Branches shifting outside, the wind pressing against the cabin, the faintest creak from the floorboards. It wasn't the usual sounds of an old house settling. It felt intentional, deliberate, like something was testing the edges of the cabin, waiting for a weak spot. Owen must have heard it too, because at some point, I heard him shifting in his sleeping bag. "You awake?" he whispered. "Yeah." I swear I keep hearing something. I didn't answer. I just listened. The others were still. Tom's breathing was slow and deep. Liam snored softly, but outside. Something moved. Not the wind. Not an animal running through the brush. This was slower. Footsteps. I sat up, heart hammering. The sound stopped the second I moved. I held my breath, waiting. Silence. Owen sat up too, looking at me. In the dim light from the dying fire in the living room, I could just make out his face, pale, tense. Then it started again. Soft, crunching steps circling the cabin. I reached for my phone, squinting at the screen. No signal. Owen mouthed, "What do we do?" I had no answer. We waited, frozen, until the footsteps faded into the distance. I don't know how long we sat there, but eventually, exhaustion won. Owen laid back down, and I did the same. Morning came, and everything felt normal again. At breakfast, I waited for someone else to mention it. No one did. Tom acted like nothing was wrong, stirring his coffee lazily. Liam scrolled through his phone, muttering about the lack of service. Owen kept glancing at me, but he didn't say anything either. Finally, I spoke up. "Did anyone hear something last night?" Liam looked up. "Like what?" "Footsteps." Tom snorted. "Dude, you're freaking yourself out." Owen put his mug down. "I heard it too." Tom's expression shifted slightly. "Probably an animal." I shook my head. "It wasn't. It was slow, steady." Liam frowned. "You sure it wasn't one of us?" "No one moved," Owen said. "It was outside." The air in the room felt heavier now. No one spoke for a moment. Then Tom stood up, stretching. Alright, enough of this ghost story crap. We're in the middle of the woods. Stuff makes noise. End of discussion. Owen and I exchanged a look, but said nothing. We decided to hike again, this time in a different direction. The trail we picked was rougher, less maintained. The deeper we went, the stranger the woods felt. The silence was unnatural. It wasn't just quiet, it was too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves. Even our footsteps felt muted, swallowed by the thick air. Liam finally broke the silence. Does this place feel weird to anyone else? Tom scoffed. It's just the woods, man. But even he didn't sound convinced. We walked for nearly an hour before we saw something ahead. A structure, just like the one we found the day before. Same splintered log, same uneven build, same deep, deliberate scratches. This is different, Liam muttered. Owen stepped closer, his hands clenched into fists. No, it's the same damn thing. I looked at him. What do you mean? This is where we were yesterday. This exact spot. I felt my stomach drop. That's impossible. We went in the opposite direction. Liam turned in a slow circle. It looks the same. Tom exhaled sharply. You guys are losing it. It's just another old shack. Owen walked around the structure. His voice was tight when he spoke. There's the mark I touched yesterday. He pointed to the scratched log. Same place. Same scratches. No one spoke. I pulled out my phone, opening the compass app. The needle spun in slow, lazy circles. Okay, that's not normal, Liam said, stepping back. Tom ran a hand through his hair, clearly irritated now. I don't know what to tell you. It's a coincidence. Owen turned to me. Let's go back. Now, we retraced our steps. Or at least, we tried. The woods didn't look the same anymore. Trees that should have been familiar felt wrong. The path was unfamiliar. I knew we were walking straight back to the cabin, but after another 30 minutes, the trees thinned, and we stepped into a clearing. The structure stood in front of us again. Liam swore under his breath. Owen turned to Tom. Still think it's a coincidence? Tom looked genuinely rattled now. He swallowed hard, then shook his head. We must have walked in a circle. We didn't, I said. We went straight. No one argued. Owen took a deep breath. Let's just pick a direction and go. We moved fast this time, barely speaking. My hands were sweating, my heart racing. The trees felt like they were pressing in. The air was too still. Finally, after what felt like forever, we saw the cabin. The relief was short-lived. The front door was wide open. Owen stopped. No way. Liam hesitated. Maybe we shut that door, I said. No one wanted to be the first inside. Tom finally stepped forward, pushing the door open the rest of the way. Everything looked normal. The furniture was in place. The bags were untouched. But the air inside was different, heavy, like it had been disturbed. Owen stepped in beside me. Something's wrong. Liam pointed toward the fireplace. Guys, there, just above the mantel, was a new set of scratches. 5 long, deep marks, carved into the wood. Exactly like the ones on the shack. Tom stepped closer, staring at them. His jaw tightened. Okay, now I'm freaked out. Owen turned to me. We need to leave. I nodded. First thing in the morning, we locked the door, shut the windows, and sat in the living room, no one wanting to be alone. The fire burned low, casting flickering shadows across the walls. At some point, Tom cleared his throat. If we're all here, who opened the door? No one answered. The wind howled outside, and just beyond it, faint but unmistakable, footsteps. The footsteps didn't stop. They circled the cabin, slow and deliberate. Each crunch of leaves, each shift of weight against the wooden porch sent a jolt through my body. Owen and I locked eyes. Liam gripped the arm of the couch so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Tom, who had spent the last 2 days scoffing at our paranoia, now sat frozen, his face pale. No one spoke. No one moved. The fire crackled weakly in the hearth, casting warped shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind had picked up, pushing against the cabin as if trying to force its way in. The heavy wooden door stood closed, locked with the deadbolt we had checked twice. But none of that mattered, because something was already inside. I felt it before I saw it. A shift in the air. A wrongness. A slow, measured creak echoed from the far end of the cabin, the hallway leading to the bedrooms. My stomach dropped. Every hair on my body stood on end. I turned my head slowly. A door was open. Not just open, wide open. We had shut every door before we sat down. Liam exhaled sharply. "No," he whispered. "No, no, no." Tom shot to his feet. "Who's there?" His voice cracked at the end. No answer. Owen grabbed my wrist, his grip iron tight. His breathing was shallow, his pulse hammering against my skin. The footsteps outside continued, steady, unhurried, like whoever, whatever was out there knew we had nowhere to go. Then the floor creaked inside the cabin. It came from the hallway. Tom turned toward it, his entire body tense. The firelight flickered, and for a brief second, something moved at the edge of the shadows. A shape, a figure. Not solid, not fully formed, but there. Tom lunged for the fireplace poker, yanking it from its stand. I swear to God, the footsteps stopped. The cabin fell into absolute silence. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring, that presses against your skull, that swallows everything whole. Then, a whisper, not from outside, from behind us, right behind us. I turned so fast I nearly fell. The whisper wasn't a word. It wasn't a language. It was wrong, layered, like multiple voices speaking at once, low and guttural, then high and sharp. It came from the darkened corner of the room, where the firelight didn't reach. Tom lifted the poker. "Come out." His voice was hoarse. Nothing moved. The whisper came again, closer this time. Then something ran, not toward us, through us. A rush of freezing air slammed into my chest, knocking the breath from my lungs. Liam yelped, staggering backward, his arms flailing. Tom swore. Owen grabbed my arm, his nails digging into my skin. The bedroom doors slammed shut all at once. The fire died in an instant, plunging the room into near darkness. Owen cursed under his breath, reaching for his phone. He turned on the flashlight, sweeping it across the cabin. The beam trembled in his hands. Nothing. No one. Liam was breathing hard. That wasn't the wind. Tom didn't argue. His grip on the poker was so tight that his knuckles had gone bloodless. I forced myself to move. My entire body felt sluggish, like I was wading through something thick and suffocating. "We need to get out," I said. Owen nodded. "Now." Tom turned toward the door. He reached out, his fingers brushing the handle. And then he stopped. He stood frozen, his back to us. His shoulders were tense, his entire body rigid. I swallowed. "Tom?" No answer. A low breath rasped out of him. Then, slowly, too slowly, he turned his head to the side, just enough for me to see his face. His eyes were wide, not with fear, with something else. Something worse. His lips twitched into a smile, but it wasn't his smile. It was wrong, stretched too wide, teeth too visible, like something else was trying to wear his face. A breath slipped out of him, low, uneven, a mix between a chuckle and a gasp. Then he lurched toward us. Liam screamed. Owen shoved me back so hard I nearly fell. Tom's entire body convulsed, his limbs jerking like a marionette being yanked by invisible strings. His fingers twisted, the poker dropping from his grip with a loud clang. His neck snapped to the side, his eyes rolling back for a split second before snapping forward again. His mouth opened, and the whisper came pouring out, not in his voice, in all of them. Layered, wrong, unnatural. Owen grabbed me. Run. I didn't hesitate. We bolted for the door. Liam fumbled with the lock, his hands shaking so badly that it took him 3 tries to get it open. Tom's footsteps slammed against the wooden floor as he charged toward us. We burst onto the porch, nearly toppling over each other. The air outside was freezing, cutting through our clothes like needles. The moon barely lit the clearing, casting long, jagged shadows across the ground. Owen grabbed my arm. The truck. Liam was already sprinting toward it. Tom screamed behind us. Not in pain, in rage. Like something inside him was furious that we were getting away. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Liam reached the truck first, yanking the door open. Owen shoved me inside, scrambling into the driver's seat. His hands were shaking so badly he nearly dropped the keys. Tom was right there. I caught a glimpse of him in the side mirror. His face wasn't right. It was wrong. His features twisted, his skin stretched, like something inside him was pressing against it, trying to claw its way out. Owen turned the key. The truck sputtered. Tom's head jerked to the side. His mouth opened wider than it should have been able to. Owen turned the key again. The truck roared to life. Tom lunged. Liam screamed. Owen floored it. The tires screeched against the dirt. The truck fishtailed, kicking up a spray of gravel. Tom's hand slammed against the side of the truck. His fingers curled around the door handle. For a split second, I thought he was going to rip it open. Then, he stopped. Just like that. He stood in the rearview mirror, body rigid, arms limp at his sides. His head tilted. And then, slowly, so slowly, he smiled. Not at us. At something behind us. Something in the trees. Something we couldn't see. Owen didn't stop, didn't slow down. We tore through the dirt road, the truck rattling over every bump. No one spoke. No one looked back, because we didn't have to. We knew something was still watching. Owen didn't stop driving. The truck sped down the narrow, winding road, headlights bouncing against the trees, casting jagged shadows that seemed to shift and twist. The wheels kicked up dirt and gravel, the suspension groaning under the weight of our frantic escape. No one spoke. Liam was in the back seat, curled up against the door, his breathing erratic. Owen's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched so tight that I thought his teeth might crack. My heart was still slamming against my ribs, my hands trembling as I gripped the dashboard. But the worst part wasn't the fear. It was the knowledge that we weren't alone. Tom was still back at the cabin, or what used to be Tom. I had seen his face shift, stretch, distort into something inhuman. And I had seen that thing watching us from the trees. I swallowed hard. We should go to the police. Owen exhaled sharply. And tell them what? That our friend turned into, what? A demon? Hey, he shook his head. They won't believe us. Liam spoke up, his voice small. We can't just leave him there. A silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. Owen's grip tightened on the wheel. He's not Tom anymore. Liam turned to look at me, his eyes glassy, desperate. You saw what happened. It was like he snapped. Maybe he needs help. I opened my mouth, then closed it, because I wasn't sure if what we had seen could even be explained. Liam wasn't wrong. Tom had snapped, but not in a way that made sense. Not in a way that could be fixed. The whispering, the unnatural way his body moved, that smile. Something else was inside of him, and it wasn't human. A sharp bang hit the side of the truck. Owen swerved violently, cursing under his breath. My head snapped to the window. Nothing. Just trees stretching into the blackness. Liam sat up straight. Did you see that? Owen shook his head, eyes flicking between the road and the rearview mirror. It's just the road. Another bang. This time on the roof. Liam screamed. Owen slammed the brakes. The truck skidded, tires shrieking as we jolted forward. A cloud of dust swallowed us, obscuring everything. For a few seconds, there was only silence. Then, tap, tap, tap. A slow, deliberate knock against the passenger side window. I turned my head, my pulse hammering, and froze. Tom was standing outside the truck. His face was wrong. His skin was too pale, too smooth, like it had been stretched over his skull. His eyes were wide, unblinking. His lips curled into that same smile, too wide, teeth gleaming in the darkness. He raised a hand, pressed his palm against the glass. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The whispering started again. Not from him, from everywhere. It seeped into the truck, curling around us like invisible fingers. Low, guttural voices, high-pitched murmurs. Then Tom's lips parted, and the whispering became words. Let me in. Owen threw the truck into reverse. The tires spun, kicking up dirt, but the truck barely moved. Tom's expression didn't change. His head tilted slightly, his smile growing wider. Then, suddenly, he wasn't alone. Shapes emerged from the darkness. Dozens of them. Figures just like him, too smooth, too pale, too wrong. Some of them were missing features, no eyes, no mouth. Others had too many. They stepped forward in eerie unison, their feet never quite touching the ground. Liam whimpered. No, 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 no. Owen slammed his foot on the gas. The truck lurched backward, nearly fishtailing off the road before straightening. Tom's face never changed. Not as the truck pulled away. Not as the figures closed in. Not even when he finally opened his mouth, whispering something we couldn't hear. The last thing I saw before we sped off into the night was his smile. Owen didn't stop. The truck barreled down the dirt road, the tires skidding over loose gravel as he wrestled with the wheel. The headlights barely cut through the thick darkness ahead, and I could still hear the echo of that whisper. That unnatural voice that didn't belong to Tom anymore. No one spoke. The only sound was Liam's ragged breathing in the back seat, the hum of the engine, and the occasional jolt as the truck bounced over uneven ground. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see those figures in the rearview mirror, pale, eyeless, mouths stretching too wide. But there was nothing. Just endless trees, fading into blackness. Owen's voice was low, strained. We don't stop. Not until we're out of these woods. Liam's hands were shaking. What the hell was that? I didn't answer, because I didn't know. Tom had changed. Not just mentally, not just some kind of breakdown. His face, his voice, everything about him had turned wrong. And those things, they had been waiting, watching. I turned my gaze forward, gripping the dashboard. Are we even on the right road? Owen's hands clenched the wheel. I don't care. We keep moving. The truck jolted as he pushed the gas harder. The speedometer ticked up, the road narrowing, trees whipping past in a blur. Then, a figure stepped onto the road. Owen screamed and yanked the wheel. The truck spun. The world tilted. My stomach lurched as the tires lost grip, sending us skidding sideways. The headlights flashed across the trees, illuminating twisted branches before. Impact! The truck slammed into something solid. The sound of metal crumpling, glass shattering. I was thrown forward, the seatbelt digging into my chest. A ringing filled my ears, drowning out everything else. For a few seconds, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then I heard Owen groan. Is everyone, he called, alive? Liam let out a strangled whimper from the back. I think so. Pain shot through my ribs as I shifted. The windshield was cracked, spiderwebbing from the point of impact. My fingers fumbled for the door handle, and when it finally gave way, I spilled onto the ground, gasping in the cold air. The truck's front end was mangled, steam rising from the hood. We had hit a tree, hard. Owen stumbled out after me, clutching his arm. Liam? The back door creaked open, and Liam slid out, shaking. He was pale, his hands gripping his shirt like he was trying to hold himself together. We stood there for a moment, listening. Nothing. The woods were silent. No whispering. No movement. Nothing. Owen ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. We can't stay here. The truck's dead, I said, my voice hoarse. Liam swallowed hard. We have to keep walking. I turned my gaze down the road. It stretched on into the dark, barely visible beyond the reach of the broken headlights. The thought of stepping back into that darkness made my skin crawl, but staying here felt worse. Owen squared his shoulders. Let's go. We walked. The dirt crunched beneath our feet, every step sending my pulse higher. The trees loomed overhead, branches twisted into unnatural shapes. Every few seconds, it glanced behind us, expecting to see that smile. But there was nothing. The further we got, the more the tension in my chest loosened, just slightly. The air felt clearer, less oppressive. The road widened. Then, finally, we saw it. The edge of the woods. Beyond the trees, faint streetlights glowed in the distance. A road. Civilization. Relief hit me so hard I nearly collapsed. We didn't stop moving. We kept walking until our feet hit pavement, until we could see distant headlights from passing cars. Liam let out a sob of relief. Owen turned to look at me. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held the same unspoken question that was clawing at my brain. What the hell just happened? But I didn't have an answer, because whatever had happened back there, it hadn't followed us. Had it? We didn't talk much after we got out of those woods. Owen called for help once we found a gas station, and within an hour, a tow truck and a sheriff's deputy arrived. We gave a version of events that made sense, lost control of the truck, hit a tree, and got stranded. We didn't mention Tom. We didn't mention the figures or the whisper that still clawed at the back of my mind. The deputy asked if we needed medical attention. We refused. Liam sat on the curb, staring at his hands. His fingers trembled, his skin pale. Owen paced back and forth, chewing at the inside of his cheek. I stood near the road, eyes fixed on the tree line in the distance. I expected to see something, some sign that we weren't alone. That whatever had happened to Tom, whatever had been in that cabin, had followed us. But there was nothing, just the wind pushing through the trees, just the headlights of passing cars cutting through the dark. We left the truck behind, called a ride, and didn't look back. No one spoke on the drive home. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Tom's face, or whatever had been wearing it. I saw the black pits where his eyes should have been, the grin that stretched too wide. I heard that whisper, curling around my brain like it was still inside me, still waiting. I dreamt of the woods, of the figures standing in the trees, mouths moving, but no sound coming out. And I dreamt of Tom, standing just outside my bedroom door. When I woke up, the room was silent. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. Sweat clung to my skin, and for a split second, I swore I saw movement in the shadows. But I was alone. The next few days were quiet, too quiet. Liam stopped responding to texts. Owen kept himself busy, burying himself in work, avoiding any mention of that night. I tried to act normal, tried to move on, but something had changed. One evening, I was home alone, sitting on the couch, trying to focus on some mindless TV show when my phone buzzed. A message from Liam. He's not gone. I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting. Before I could respond, another text came through. I see him outside my window. I shot up from the couch, hands shaking. I called him. The phone rang and rang. Then it went to voicemail. I drove to his apartment, my pulse hammering in my throat. His lights were on. His car was in the driveway, but he didn't answer the door. Something in my gut told me not to go inside. I stood there for a long time, staring at the door, listening. The silence felt wrong. Then, from inside, I heard a whisper. Soft, drawn out, saying my name. I turned and walked away. Liam never answered my calls after that. His apartment remained untouched for days. Eventually, his landlord found it completely empty. No sign of him, no explanation, just gone. Owen and I never spoke about it. We moved on, forced ourselves to. But every now and then, late at night, I swear I hear it. That voice, that whisper. And when I look into the dark, I wonder if something is looking back.